So welcome, everyone. I'm very excited for you to be here at our Committee on Artificial Intelligence talk with Mark Solms. My name is Fred Gioia. A few things briefly. The Committee on Artificial Intelligence is a part of the APsA's Department of Psychoanalytic Education, and our interest is to study, and on the basis of these studies, help develop educational projects about the intersection of AI and psychoanalysis. We plan on hosting several workshops in the future. So if you want to keep your pens and papers at ready, we will have a few other speakers you all may be interested in. On January 19th, we plan on having Luca Passati, and on March 7th, Fernando Castrillon. We also are gathering some vignettes about AI experience and how it influences the development, the socio-emotional development of individuals, and we will be posting those. And we also will be distributing some surveys even about AI attitudes and use cases and so forth. So if you're interested at all in the intersection of AI and psychoanalysis, please reach out to us. We are open and we are welcoming new members who are equally sincere and interested in this. Before I get started with Mark, I do want to say the Neuropsychoanalytic Organization, which Mark has co-founded, has been important for me for several years now. And, you know, when I first read Mark's work, it was as if I had gotten in touch with Oliver Sacks from my studies in med school. And I had an awakenings type moment of rekindling my own interest in many of the neuropsychological issues that brought me into this field of both psychiatry and psychoanalysis. I think many of you may know Mark, and if you don't, his work is very very much out in the world and to be read. And I encourage you to at least read some of his work in The Hidden Spring and check out some of the work on the Neuropsychoanalytic website. He speaks for himself, and I hope he will provide some useful information for you all today. I'm about to shut up, but I will just say during this talk, please mute your microphones. You can contact me if there's any technical issues directly in the chat, but don't post questions until the end. We don't want to clog up the chat line until the end. We will have Mark speak for about an hour, and then afterwards have around 30 minutes or maybe a little bit more, just depending on time, for us to continue to ask Mark questions. And I will field those questions in the chat line, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you in the order your hand was raised. So with that said, I'm very excited for this, and I am going to give the floor to Mark.
Thanks very much, Fred. Thanks to you all for being here. I must tell you, I'm a little surprised. I had in mind a small roundtable discussion. I didn't realize it was going to be a big group of us like this, but the more the merrier. So I'm going to now give you a formal presentation, starting with the premises. In other words, what was it that led me to think about consciousness in a way that becomes relevant to artificial consciousness? I never thought I would go there. I never have been interested, to be honest, in artificial intelligence until about 10 years ago, as I started doing this neuroscientific work that I'm going to talk to you about, which you will, those of you, which I gather will probably be most of you, who are psychoanalysts, you will immediately recognize how I drew upon psychoanalysis to try to resolve a question in neuroscience. And that resolution of that question led me to suddenly become interested in artificial intelligence and in particular artificial consciousness in a way that I would never have anticipated. Whenever I talk about this topic, I always feel slightly awkward. Perhaps a better word is embarrassed, because I don't know myself whether is this something really important or am I losing my mind? So you'll decide for me as I proceed. So now I'm going to dive in. I'm going to share my screen. You see the title that I've given the presentation is Affective Consciousness, Artificial Consciousness. I'm just trying to find a pointer. Okay, here we go. Here I start with this definition from Tom Nagel, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a definition of consciousness. He says an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism, something it's like for the organism. So when I speak about consciousness in this talk, I mean nothing more complex than this. I mean just the organism experiencing its own being, how it is to be. If it's actually experienced by the organism without any thoughts or reflections or whatever, then that's a conscious organism. Now, building on Tom Nagel's famous paper from 1974, in which he asks the question, what is it like to be a bat? David Chalmers built on this the hard problem of consciousness in a paper that he published 20 years later. And I'm just going to get to the heart of the matter of what Chalmers said about consciousness. He said there's no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. Chalmers's whole argument is that what we normally do in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience is we try to explain the mechanism, how memory works, how perception works, how voluntary action works, and so on. And then we think our job is done. But he says when it comes to consciousness, doing this doesn't explain anything. It explains the function, but it doesn't explain why we experience that function. So, for example, the mechanisms whereby memory comes from long-term storage into the short-term buffer. This is a mechanistic explanation, of how memories are declared, but it doesn't tell us anything about why you actually experience and how you actually experience the memory, why there is something it is like to have a memory. This is Chalmers's whole argument. And I believe, now I'm getting into, that's the background. Tom Nagel's definition of the sort of elemental consciousness. David Chalmers is saying we can't use ordinary scientific or ordinary cognitive neuroscience methods to understand consciousness. This is something utterly different. You can't just explain the function. That doesn't explain why you experience the function. Against that background, I'm now going to go into my own take on the matter. I think what Chalmers is saying here has everything to do with the word cognition. He's saying there's no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. I think that's perfectly reasonable. For example, the model that has been used to try to crack the problem of consciousness in neuroscience, the model example is visual perception. And all of the mechanistic understanding we have of visual perception doesn't begin to explain why you actually experience vision. And there's the famous story of Mary, the visual neuroscientist. The story was coined by Frank Jackson. There's Mary, the visual neuroscientist, who knows everything that there is to know about the functional physical mechanisms of vision. But let's just simplify it and say, but she's blind. Because she's blind, even though she knows everything about the function and mechanism, the information processing that goes into vision, is still, she knows nothing about what it's like to see. Then one day, thanks be to God, vision is bestowed upon her and she starts to see for the first time. And Frank Jackson's argument is, at this point, Mary will learn something utterly new about vision. Everything she knew about its functional mechanisms, its physiology, its anatomy, it's the underlying computational information processing architecture and whatnot, none of this predicted or prepared her for, or even required that there is something it is like to see. The actual experience of blueness, the experience of redness, none of this was explained by, predicted by, required by her mechanistic understanding of how visual information processing goes on. So I'm saying, yeah, okay, a cognitive function like visual perception, it's perfectly reasonable to say that explaining the function won't necessarily explain why we experience it, in this case, vision. What if we were to replace Chalmers's word cognitive with affective? Can we say there's no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience? My view is that there is an affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. And that function is feeling, the function of feeling, emotional feeling, affective feeling, raw feeling. Feelings are necessarily felt, unlike visual information processing, which readily goes on in the dark, in the sense that you don't have to experience visual perception in order for it to do its functional job. In fact, not only do we know in the human brain a lot of visual information processing goes on unconsciously, we also know that even your telephone has visual functions in the sense that it can recognize a face, it can photograph and store that information about that face. These are visual functions, and there's surely no question but that the camera in your phone is performing these visual information processing tasks, both perceiving and storing visual information without any consciousness attached to it. But can you say that about feeling? Feeling is necessarily felt. You can't understand or explain the function of feeling without explaining why you feel it. And as you're going to see in what I'm going to tell you over the next few minutes, this is not a semantic argument. It's not a linguistic trick. I'm not saying feeling is what we should be focusing on because the word means, that you have to feel it. I'm saying there is a mental function called feeling, and it is an intrinsically conscious function. And I'm going to show you that this function is intimately bound up with consciousness itself. So here's a little summary of what I've just said to you. Feeling is an intrinsically conscious function. A feeling that you don't feel is not a feeling. So we can say in advance, contra Chalmers, that explanation of the function of feeling will automatically explain experience. You will not have explained the function of feeling if you don't explain why it has to be experienced. Now, I've just told you what I think the difficulty has been with Chalmers's approach. Chalmers is talking about cognitive functions, and in particular, the model example that Chalmers, like everyone in the field of consciousness studies, has been using is visual perception, which is a cortical function. Conscious visual perception is a cortical function. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, we shouldn't be looking to the cortex in our attempts to isolate the neural mechanism, the physical mechanism whereby consciousness arises, because Cortical processes are not intrinsically conscious, just like vision is not intrinsically conscious. I could go, if later in the discussion, if you want me to, I can tell you all sorts of evidence. I can summarize all sorts of evidence to support the assertion that the cortex can process visual information without any consciousness. It's not necessary for the cortex to be conscious in order for it to process visual information, even at the very highest levels of human visual perception. For example, reading with comprehension, face recognition. These functions do not have to be conscious in order for them to operate. But in the brain stem, there are structures which are intrinsically consciousness-producing structures. And as I'm going to show you, they are also feeling-producing structures. And this is why I said to you that when I claim that we should be looking down here, it's not because the word feeling lends itself to solving the philosophical problem that Chalmers poses, but rather because the empirical evidence as to what this part of the brain actually does shows us that it generates feeling. In fact, we learned many, many years ago in 1949, to our great surprise, that consciousness does not flow in from the outside with perception. That was the assumption until the surprising discoveries of Maruzzi and Magoon. Basically, what they found was that damage to these structures marked in purple here, which are collectively known as the reticular activating system, damage to these structures in cats, and subsequently we've learned the same applies to human beings, damage to these structures obliterates consciousness entirely. The lights go out if these structures are damaged. And what I particularly want to draw your attention to is that if you sever, as Magoon and Maruzzi did, sever the fibers ascending from these purple structures, the fibers that go from there to the cortex of the forebrain, if you sever them, if you disconnect the cortex from the reticular activating system, then the cortex is no longer capable of producing conscious perception or conscious cognition. So cortical cognition and perception, to the extent that it is conscious, that consciousness is contingent upon activation by the reticular activating system. So for me, that shows that the consciousness doesn't flow in from the outside. The consciousness is an endogenous property of the brain generated from the inside. And to illustrate that point as emphatically as I can, the smallest area of damage in the human brain that obliterates consciousness entirely is a mere 2 cubic millimeters, that is to say the size of a match head, in the parabrachial complex, which is part of the reticular activating system. It's not that consciousness arises from these 2 cubic millimeters, so much as that damage, the smallest area of damage that reliably produces coma in the human brain, is in this part of the reticular activating system. But you can likewise produce coma by damaging larger areas of any of these reticular activating nuclei. Now, since this was known in 1949 already, that the reticular activating system is prerequisite, that it unless it activates the cortex information processing goes on without consciousness, it goes on unconsciously, it goes on in the dark. Since we've known that since 1949, why have we been thinking of the cortex as the seat of consciousness and using functions, cortical functions like visual perception, as our model examples of consciousness? And the reason for that, the answer to that question, is because the way that Magoon and Maruzzi interpret their findings was that all that the brainstem provides is a quantitative level, a sort of background volume of consciousness, but that the actual contents or qualities, in other words, the phenomenal stuff of consciousness itself, is generated in the cortex. So what they said was that the booting up of the cortex by the brainstem is a prerequisite for the cortex to be able to perform its conscious functions. And the analogy that they used, and which is still used to this day in cognitive neuroscience textbooks, is that the reticular activating system provides a power supply like a television set being plugged in at the wall. The power supply comes from that power source, but the actual business of consciousness, on this analogy, the business of the televisual programming, the actual images and the content, the qualities of sound and sight and make up the actual stuff of televisual programming. This is produced by the television set, i.e. the cortex. A prerequisite for it to be able to do that is that the television set has to be plugged in at the wall. But that doesn't mean that that quantity, that energy supply, is the televisual content itself. It's just a prerequisite, a necessary prior condition. So that's how we've understood what the brainstem supplies. And that's why we've thought that the place to look for the neural correlates of consciousness is the cortex. And I'm now going to spend the next few minutes showing you why that view is wrong. This picture, this interpretation that Magoon and Maruzzi gave to their findings is unsustainable in light of the evidence. So if the cortex is where the actual qualitative content of consciousness is generated, if that were true, then what would happen if you were to exclude cortex? Of course, in human beings, we can't literally decorticate. We can't remove the cortex from human beings. But there are some kids who are born with no cortex, so they provide us with a natural experiment. These children have a normal brain stem, but they have no cortex. So if Magoon and Maruzzi's view is correct, that the contents and qualities of consciousness, all of them, are provided by the cortex, these kids should have no phenomenal, there should not be anything that it is like to be these children. Now, it is quite hard to imagine what are we talking about? How can you have a power supply that sort of boots up your consciousness, but it has no content and no quality? Well, there is a neurological condition. It used to be called the vegetative state. We no longer use that term because it's kind of offensive to say to a parent, your child is vegetative. You know, it implies your child is a vegetable. So we now use the term non-responsive wakefulness, which means the child still has a autonomic sleep-waking cycle. They wake up in the morning and they go to sleep at night, but their consciousness is blank. It's blank wakefulness in the sense that there's nobody home. There's no experience. It's just that switching on the power that I explained to you in the analogy with the television set. Please note the term non-responsive wakefulness. So if the cortex is the seat of the phenomenal consciousness, then these kids with no cortex should have no phenomena. They should have no content. They should have no quality to their wakefulness. So let's test that hypothesis. Here we do. Here's the child whose scan you just saw. There she is. Clearly she's awake, as expected. But much more interesting is when her baby brother is placed on her lap, she responds. She is responsive. Remember the definition of the vegetative state, non-responsive wakefulness. She responds emotionally. She goes, ah, she likes it. She likes the experience of her brother being placed on her lap. And she's not alone. I'm giving you just one example, one illustrative example. That's how these kids generally are. Here's another such child. Tell me this child is non-responsive. And the crucial thing you must notice is that the responsivity is emotional. It's not only that they respond emotionally in general, it's that they respond emotionally specifically, appropriately to the stimulus. So if you go like this, they get a startle response. If you tickle them, they giggle. If you place their baby brothers in their laps, they go, ah. If you take the baby brother away, they go, they cross. So all of these basic emotional responses you see in these kids. Some of you might wonder, how on earth is that possible if they have no cortex? How do they even know that their brother is placed on their lap if they have no cortex to register the event? And so I'll just quickly take a little sidebar to explain that. Each of the special senses, here we're using vision, but the same applies to somatic sensation and hearing. So the child registers this information, in this case, visual. This pathway goes via the lateral genicular to the visual cortex. In these kids, obviously, that's not possible because there is no cortex. But the visual information is also transmitted to the brainstem, to a structure called the superior colliculi, where it is processed unconsciously. And remember, it's not just vision. All the special senses send information there. It's unconsciously processed. And then the emotional response, which is a structure right next to the superior colliculi, the periaqueductal gray, selects emotional responses, and the child then feels something, but it doesn't know why it's feeling what it's feeling. So it has no image, it has no explanation, it has no knowledge as to why it has this warm, fuzzy feeling when its brother's placed on its lap. It just knows this feels good, that feels bad, etc. So they have raw feelings without any knowledge, any cognitive understanding, any perceptual images that explain the feelings that they're having, but nevertheless they have the feelings. That's what these images show us. These children have feelings. Of course, we accept that they can't possibly understand the source of their feelings, but clearly they are displaying them. Now, the problem is, how do we know that the fact that they're behaving like this is accompanied by a subjective inner state of feeling? The normal requirement in cognitive neuroscience is that if you're going to claim that a certain stimulus is felt, then the research participant must report the feeling. Reportability is the gold standard. I am feeling happy, or I am feeling startled, or I am feeling irritated. That's the only evidence that you possibly can count on that the child is feeling what she appears to be feeling. Obviously, these children can't report their mental states because they have no cortex, they have no language, they can't. And this allows for a radical skepticism. How do we know that these aren't just reflexes? These aren't just instinctual behavioral stereotypes. So for that reason, I'm going to show you very quickly various other lines of evidence which get around the problem of reportability, which make it reasonable to assume that these kids are conscious, and more so, make it reasonable to assume that raw feeling is generated in the brainstem. It's not something that is contingent upon the cortex. So the first such piece of evidence is that if you stimulate with deep brain with electrodes located deep in the brainstem, if you stimulate core brainstem structures, you generate intense emotional states, which these patients who have intact cortex can report. So this is a way of getting around the problem that those little kids with no cortex can't report. We say, well, let's try another approach. Let's stimulate these reticular activating system structures, and let's see what the experience is that is thus generated. And these patients report intense emotions. The most intense emotions are generated by stimulating reticular activating system and also the periaqueductal gray, which I showed you earlier. The most intense and the widest variety of emotional experiences are reported from stimulating these structures much more so than anywhere else in the brain. If you stimulate cortex, you get thoughts about feelings or memories of feelings. You most certainly do not get intense raw affect. So this is a second line of evidence to suggest that this is where feelings are generated. Here's a third line of evidence. This is functional imaging, in this case, positron emission tomography. If feelings are generated in the cortex, then if you image the brains of people who are in intense affective states, then you should expect to see intense activation of the cortex. Whereas if the feelings are actually generated in the brain stem, then that's where you should expect to see the activity, and that's indeed what we actually see. So in the case of anger and sadness and happiness and fear, all of them, you see the epicenter of the activation of the brain in these intense emotional states is in the brain stem, not in the cortex. Exactly what you would have predicted if the affects are actually generated in and by the brain stem. And here's the the fourth line of evidence. The neurochemicals, the neurotransmitters that are sourced in the reticular activating system, if you up and down regulate these neurotransmitters pharmacologically, then you don't just wake up or put to sleep the patient in a way that, or the person in the way that an anesthetist might. Rather, what you do is you modulate the emotional state of the patient in the way that a psychiatrist might. Psychiatrists, of course, give SSRIs in order to treat depression, and they give dopamine blockers in order to treat psychosis, and they give noradrenaline or norepinephrine, as you call it in America, blockers in order to treat anxiety. So these chemicals, when you modulate, when you up and down regulate them, it doesn't just increase or decrease the volume or the level of consciousness. It changes its quality and its content. So summing up all of these things, the conclusion that I think we are driven to is that when Magoon and Maruzzi originally discovered that all consciousness is contingent upon brainstem arousal, they thought it's because it's like a power source, doesn't have any content or quality of its own, and I think that that was wrong. On the basis of all of the evidence I've just shown you, it does have content and quality. That content and quality is affective, and so what that suggests, if I can emphasize this point, is that the prerequisite for all other forms of consciousness is not a power supply, but rather a feeling. Feeling, the capacity to feel, raw feeling, affective feeling, is the basic, elemental, fundamental, prerequisite form of consciousness. So when I said to you earlier, when I say feeling is what we should be looking to as our model example of consciousness, I said it's not on the basis of semantic or linguistic arguments, but rather on the basis of empirical and physiological and anatomical evidence. That's the evidence that I've just showed you. The part of the brain which is intrinsically responsible for booting up the cortex, for rendering the cortex conscious, for making perceptual and cognitive processing of information consciously experienceable, that is the reticular activating system that does that. And the reticular activating system generates feeling. Now I move that those are the physiological, anatomical, neuroscientific arguments that set me up for where I'm heading, because I'm wanting to move now toward implications of all of this for artificial consciousness. So I want to just introduce you to these three different concepts. Everyone knows what is meant by neurotransmission. It's the passing of messages. It's also known as synaptic activity. In computational science, we call this signal states. These signal states, the passing of messages, are modulated by what we physiologically call postsynaptic gain. This is neuromodulation. In computational terms, These are called not signal states, but signal precisions. It is the variability in the signal. A highly variable signal is a noisy signal. It's an imprecise signal, and a signal which is reliable is a precise signal. And then the synaptic activity, which is modulated by postsynaptic gain, determines synaptic efficiency. In other words, neuromodulation of neurotransmission determines neuroplasticity. This is learning. Signal parameters are altered over time by neuromodulation of neurotransmission. So these three things, these three concepts, they map onto what I've told you so far, in that the transmission of messages like visual signals coming from the retina, that these states and the learning that flows from them, the plasticity, which we call the parameters in computational terms, are modulated by precisions. In other words, by how confident the organism, how confident the system is in terms of how reliable is the signal. A signal which is very noisy can safely be ignored. A signal which is very precise is a reliable signal. You have great confidence that something is actually happening here. I just wanted to introduce you to these general concepts. That maps onto cognition and perception, which is mostly unconscious, as Freud taught us, mostly unconscious, unlike the modulation that comes from the brainstem, which on the basis of the empirical evidence I've showed you, it's intrinsically conscious. Its whole purpose is to generate consciousness. It is to render conscious the otherwise unconscious functions of the cortex. And this is done via feeling. That's the point that I'm making. So the modulation, you feel your way into your cognitions, which are otherwise unconscious. I'm sorry, I'm assuming that most of you have heard all of this before, or many of you have heard all of this before. I'm sort of giving you the headlines. If I was to give you more detail, it would take me hours and hours. So I hope I'm carrying you with me as I go over these different steps of the argument. Now, with all of that behind us, bearing in mind what Chalmers said, that there is no cognitive function, such as if you explain the function, you will automatically explain why it's experienced. And I said, that's true of cognitive functions like visual perception, but it's not true of affective function called feeling, because feelings are automatically felt. So if you explain the function of feeling, you will automatically explain why it's experienced. So let us now address what is the function of feeling. We think the functional mechanism of feeling is basically homeostatic. We have viable bounds. We living creatures have to remain within certain temperature ranges, blood sugar ranges, blood oxygen ranges, various blood pressure, not various, invariable blood pressure ranges, and so on. That's where we need to be. If we move out of that range, then there's an innate prediction in the form of a reflex, an autonomic response based on what has been learnt, in inverted commas, over evolutionary time by natural selection, what works and what doesn't work. So there's a demand that something needs to be done if you're moving out of your viable bounds, and then the control center of the homeostat does that thing, which returns you to your viable bounds. This works automatically in terms of reflexes like blood pressure regulation and so on, but feeling is an extended form of this. So if you move out of your viable bounds, like, for example, normal, the blood gas balance that you need between oxygen and carbon dioxide is normally autonomically maintained. Breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide, breathe in oxygen, breathe out. That's, it always works, as long as you are in the environment that's expected by evolution. The prediction is all you need to do is expand your intercostal muscles and then you'll be fine. Except when the environment does not contain the expected level of oxygen. Then when you breathe in, like if, for example, you're in a carbon dioxide-filled room in a burning building, then what you experience is unpleasant feeling of air hunger, we call it. And the reason why feeling, remember that's what we're talking about, the reason why feeling arises is so that the organism knows I'm moving out of where I need to be, and an autonomic response, there's not some automatic prediction available. I'm in a state of uncertainty as to what to do, and the feeling guides what the creature does. So in a burning building, if you go upstairs, you will feel more air hunger. If you go downstairs, you will feel the relief of the fact that the oxygen is down there. And so feeling enables voluntary action. It enables choosing to change our minds. I'm not going to do this because it feels bad. Instead, I'm going to do that because it feels good. And this is how we navigate uncertain environments, how we transcend the shackles of reflex, and how voluntary action becomes possible, how choice becomes possible. Choice is underwritten by feeling. So that's the basic extended form of homeostasis that underwrites feeling. This is the mechanism whereby feeling arises. This is how and why feeling arises. I just need to emphasize one further point, which is that we don't just have a general function called feeling. There's not just a thing called unpleasure and pleasure. We have different qualities of pleasure and unpleasure. So feeling suffocation alarm is different from feeling thirst, is different from feeling sleepiness, is different from feeling anger, and so on. Each category of need has its own qualitative feel. And to translate this into formal mechanistic terms, into statistical mechanical terms, if it were just a matter of generic pleasure, unpleasure, registering needs in general, then it's a continuous variable. So, for example, 8 out of 10 of sleepiness plus 8 out of 10 of thirst would mean 16 out of 20 of total need. And all you need to then do is sleep, and you'll reduce the total quantity. That isn't how it works. If you just sleep and don't drink, you'll die. This is because each need has to be met in its own right. Each one of our organismic needs is a categorical variable. And here's the essential point. Categorical variables just are qualitatively distinguished from each other. That's why you can't add 8 out of 10 of sleepiness to 8 out of 10 of thirst. They are not the same thing. There's no common denominator. So these are categorical variables. That means they are inherently, mathematically, qualitatively different from each other. So the mechanism of homeostasis is that the organism, this extended form of homeostasis that generates feeling, is the organism is registering its needs. How well or badly am I doing in terms of my basic imperative, the value system that underwrites all life, which is that it's good to be alive and bad to be dead. This is what underpins the whole of evolution. Anything that enhances survival and reproductive fitness, this is good. And anything that detracts from it, this is bad. The way that these values inherent in natural selection are experienced by each individual organism is in the form of pleasures and unpleasures. Unpleasure means you're heading toward your demise. Pleasure means you're more likely to survive. So every organism which has this functionality called feeling, it's registering how well or badly it's doing in terms of this basic value system, that it's good to survive and bad to die. In other words, pleasurable states are good, unpleasurable states are bad. These are intrinsically subjective states. Please note that the organism is registering its own needs. It only matters to the organism and for the organism. It doesn't matter to the universe. This is good or bad for me. Feelings are inherently subjective. and inherently valenced. The goodness and badness, the increasing or decreasing deviation from a homeostatic viable bounds. And then please note the last point I made, that this applies across multiple categorical variables. So each one of these different types of need must be formally, mechanistically, statistically, must be qualitatively distinguishable from each other. So there you have mechanistically described. Remember what Chalmers said, that no explanation of the function will explain why it's felt. I've just explained to you mechanistically the function of feeling and why it's felt, why it's necessarily is subjective, why it necessarily has valence, goodness and badness, and why it necessarily has quality. The ground zero of qualia has to do with the categorical nature of our organismic needs. So the function of feeling is to modulate choice in uncertain environments. It's not just reflex. If you move beyond what reflex can deal with into states of uncertainty, then the organism can choose. I'm not going to do this. This feels bad. I'm going to do that. This feels good. And thereby it does the right thing before it's too late in an environment which is not predicted by its reflexes. This enables voluntary action. And then very importantly, once you have survived such a situation by feeling your way through the problem, then the next time you find yourself in the same situation, you have learnt from experience what to do. You can predict on the basis of past experience what to do. And I really cannot emphasize enough the word experience. It's the feeling your way through the problem, that the experiencing of this situation in the past, which enables you to predict what to do in the future. So I want to just quickly walk you through the physiology of how and anatomy of how all of this happens in the mammalian, in the human brain. First of all, their body monitoring nuclei. The best one known is the nuclei in the medial hypothalamus, but there are others too. They're all marked in red here. These are the homeostatic mechanisms that I spoke about. These structures are measuring how far away am I moving further from my homeostatic set point, from my homeostatic viable bounds? Am I moving closer towards them? There are multiple such homeostats. They're constantly being monitored by these body monitoring nuclei. Then right here, the periaqueductal gray that I pointed out to you earlier, all of the homeostats send their error signals, in other words, their deviation signals. How far am I from where I need to be? All of those quantities, which remember are categorically distinguishable from each other, all of them are transmitted to periaqueductal gray. And there they must be prioritized. You can't, the action bottleneck is such as that you can't do everything at once. So there's a prioritization of which of these homeostatic deviations is the most salient here and now. And that is calculated not only on the basis of how big is the need, but also where is the opportunity. Remember I told you earlier that the superior colliculi receive unconscious information about the state of the environment across the special senses. So it's a matter of needs and opportunities, and then a prioritization is made at the level of the superior colliculi. What that means, this is crucial, is that the need that is prioritized is the one that is felt. In other words, I need to feel my way through this problem because I'm uncertain about what to do. The other needs are relegated to automaticity. So there's a fixed action program, whether it be visceral or behavioral. There's an automatic following what I've learned in the past, but the one that is prioritized is the one that is felt. This is the category of need that I'm now feeling. I'm scared, I'm angry, I'm thirsty, I'm in pain, I'm hungry, I'm sleepy, or whatever the case may be. And now I've got to solve this problem. I've got to feel my way through the environment I'm uncertain about what to do. This is crucial. I'm uncertain about what to do, so I palpate my confidence. Are things turning out as expected, or is uncertainty prevailing? As I go upstairs, am I more confident that this way I'm going to meet my oxygen needs? No, I'm not. I'm less confident. So I change my mind and I go downstairs. So there's a modulating of your confidence in the policy that you're following, only in the category of need that has been prioritized. The other ones have fixed levels of confidence. That's what automaticity is. And remember, the confidence is the precision. So the precision is fixed. The confidence in the action program is fixed. In the one that's felt, the very meaning of it being felt is that there is uncertainty. I call it felt uncertainty. It's feeling, is the precision in the signal as it was expected, or is it different? So the amplitude in the precisions, in the error signals, are compared to the expected precisions. And in this way, you're palpating your confidence, you're palpating your uncertainty. And it's all tethered, of course, to feeling. So let me just quickly sum up. The relationship between affective and cognitive consciousness can be sort of formulated in an aphorism like this. I feel like this. That's the affective consciousness about that. That is the action program and its consequences. It's feeling your way into the perceptions and the cognitions. The feelings, again alluding to Freud, are a demand for work, Freud's definition of drive. And the conscious cognition, the predictive work, is the work so demanded, the palpating of, is this turning out as expected? So the affective consciousness is a question. It's a state of uncertainty. And the cognitive consciousness is an attempted answer to that question. I'm mindful of the fact that I've been speaking for nearly an hour. I must wrap up. The mechanistic properties of a system that feels are, firstly, it's homeostatic. That is to say, it has a number of prior preferences. There are a number of viable states that it has to remain in. It is blanketed. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but basically what it boils down to is it's separated from its environment. It's not just, there's not a continuity between the system and its environment. It has sensory and motor boundary that separates the system from the not system. It's a self-organizing system, which means everything it does is in the service of the imperative to continue to exist as a system. Such a system has subjective values, as I explained to you earlier. It has needs that only apply to it. Therefore, it has a point of view. It's only my needs in relation to the world. That's my perspective upon the world. And it has intentionality. What it is trying to do, its intentionality, is the goal-directed basic functionality of the system is what is it that keeps somebody muted me, sorry. So such a system, that John Haugland, the philosopher, said, computers don't give a damn. Well, a system like this gives a damn. It gives a damn about its own continued existence, which is the basic design feature of such a system. This applies to living systems.
Let's go to yellow.
We have an Italian family joining us. So again, I'm not going to go into the technical details here, just to say that such a system has a generative model. In other words, it has to infer the causes of its sensory states, what is increasing and what is decreasing the deviation from my homeostatic needs. These homeostatic needs have to apply over multiple categories, and it has to prioritize those needs. Everything I just showed you about the physiology and anatomy of consciousness and feeling, here I'm turning it into formal mechanistic terms. My point is that any system that has this functionality is a system which feels. It's a system which is sequestered from its environment, it's separate from its environment, it has a point of view, and it has values That is, it's trying to continue to exist as a system, and these values are measured in terms of increasing or decreasing deviations from what are its viable states, and these deviations are categorically distinguishable, qualitatively distinguishable from each other. This is the kind of system. If a system has these kinds of mechanisms, then it's a system which feels. Mechanistically, I would have to say such a system feels. Now, Friston reduced the mechanisms of homeostasis and the prediction, the learning from experience of how to remain in homeostasis. He reduced it all to a set of mathematical formalisms in a fantastic paper from 2013 called Life as We Know It. And when I read this paper, that was the sort of aha moment for me. I thought, if Friston can reduce homeostasis, which is not a very complicated thing, if he can reduce it to mathematical formalisms, then if feeling is an extended form of homeostasis, then it should be possible to reduce that to a mathematical formalism too. And that's what I then did with Friston. A few years later, we formulated this extended form. How is the homeostasis that gives rise to action and perception, in other words, the homeostatic system registering what state am I in, what's causing this state, and formulating predictions as to what must I do in order to return myself to my viable state. These mechanisms that Friston formalized in his 2013 paper, we then extended it to what sort of formalism will explain how affect works. So I'll just very quickly run you through this. The system, remember, it has predictions. I told you we're born with reflex predictions, but then we want to learn from experience to update those predictions. And in order to deal with uncertain environments, the predictions take this form. If given my knowledge, my model of the outside world, that's what we call a generative model, given my model of the outside world, I predict that if I act this way on the world, then the following sensory consequences will flow from my actions. That's how such a system works. Now, if the expected consequences do not flow from the actions, then the prediction is wrong. That's called prediction error. And then there's an error signal. An error signal is the difference between the state that was predicted to flow from the action and the state that actually flowed from the action. That produces an error signal. And here comes the crucial thing about precision, which I emphasized so much earlier. Precision modulation, physiologically postsynaptic gain, the modulating, the palpating of the signal strength, of the confidence in the variability, the noise, this noise or is this signal, that is modulated by precision, which is felt uncertainty. Remember the comparing of the expected consequences of your actions in relation to the actual consequences of your actions. And so basically here you have feeling in the sense that if your predictions are confirmed, then in other words, if things are turning out as expected, that's good. If uncertainty prevails, that's bad. That's the goodness and badness tethered to feelings, which modulates our confidence in our predictions in relation to the error signals. In other words, what Freud would have called reality testing, wishes and reality testing, modulated by the pleasure principle. And you'll notice that that I'm using here all of these symbols from Freud's project in order to show that all of this is rooted in drives. All of this is rooted in the basic insights that Freud has contributed to an understanding of the subjectivity of mental life, of why it is felt, why it's experienced, what Freud called psychical reality. So this formalism here, I'm not going to bother. Here's what it says in words. Basically, the rate of change of precision, omega, over time depends on how much free energy. Free energy is basically just average error. average prediction error, how much it changes when you change precision. This means that precision will look as if it's trying to minimize free energy. In other words, feeling, this is the function that it has, felt uncertainty. And then there's a thing about the rate of it in relation to prediction error. So Richard Feynman, when he died in 1988, on his blackboard was this, probably something close to his final words, therefore. He wrote, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." In other words, if we think that we've got a mechanism whereby feeling is generated, then we should be able to artificially engineer a system that feels. Any system that instantiates the principles, the mechanistic formalism that I just showed you, if it does not feel, then that is not that does not account causally for how feelings arise. So that's what we're busy doing over the last few years. Myself and the team of physicists and applied mathematicians and computational scientists and roboticists, we're working on developing such a system. It's a blanketed in the sense of sequestered from its environment, self-organizing in the sense that its only functionality is it's trying to continue to exist as a system. Our blanketed artificial agent has 3 categories of need. Remember, they have to be qualitatively different from each other. Power supply, temperature regulation, and whatnot. It has to learn from experience how to meet those needs and thereby how to survive in a constantly changing environment. So that's what we've been working on. Here's the formalism that we're using. I'm not going to bother you with all of these details. It's basically called a partially observable Markov decision process. Our functional criterion for success, in other words, how do we know that we've actually done what we set out to do? The functional criterion, the objective one, is simply survival of the agent in uncertain environments. In other words, if our agent can continue to exist as an agent in environments for which it has no pre-programmed predictions, in other words, if it has to feel its way through this situation using the mechanisms I've just described, then it will survive. If it survives in these unpredicted environments, well, then it's done what we predicted it would. Therefore, we've confirmed that it has the functionality that we expected. But here's the huge problem, which is really an epistemological problem. Even if our agent, which, by the way, it already does, survive in unpredicted, uncertain environments, it's able to feel its way through problems and make choices and display voluntary behavior and learn from the experience. How do we know that it's actually feeling its way through those problems? How do we know that there's actually something it is like to be our agent? And I'm going to end with that point because I'm very much aware of the time constraints. I'm sorry I've gone over them already. The standard, as I said, in relation to my hydranencephalic children, the ones who can't report their mental states, the standard criterion for how do you know whether an organism is conscious is it has to be able to report, I am in pain. The standard view is that unless you can report your mental states, there's no empirical criterion for determining whether there is a conscious state or not. I think that's an absurdly simple criterion. Of course, it's very easy to program our agent to just say, I am feeling hungry, or I am feeling short of electricity, which is what it actually does feel. That means nothing. It's like, when you try to do something on the internet and you have to prove you're not a robot, you don't just report, I am not a robot. You have to actually perform some task which demonstrates you're not a robot. And it usually involves navigating some uncertainty. Other ways in which we can determine whether or not our agent is using feeling is we can correlate activity in the critical components of the system that we believe are the ones that are underpinning this functionality. And we can see if changes, in other words, measuring the activity in those components is actually what's driving the behaviors. And then we can damage those or enhance those modules. And so this is like we do in neuroscience. You lesion it, you stimulate it, like I was showing you we did with the human patients, and then you see, does it lead to the resulting, the consequences you predicted it would? We mustn't set a higher bar for the scientific study of consciousness than for anything else in science. So those are the ordinary. You have predictions, and then you try to falsify them. But I think that this is really the best test. So I want to spend a moment on this. This is based on what we see in fish. Fish have reticular activating systems. They have periaqueductal gray, and they seem to be capable of learning from experience. So there's every reason to believe that they are conscious. In other words, that they feel like something. It feels like something to be a fish, but how do you know? Same as with our artificial agent. How do you know? So the method that was developed with these fish, I want to quickly describe it to you. The fish live in a fish tank, and you place the food always on this side of the tank, and then the fish tend to hang out there. And that's called conditioned place preference behavior. Then, that's no surprise. Then what we do is we place pleasure-producing substances on the other side of the tank. And this has been done with cocaine, with morphine, with amphetamines, and even with nicotine. And if the fish have feelings, then the prediction is they'll go there where the cocaine is because it feels good. It's not nutritionally good. It doesn't have any survival value in and of itself. It's just a good feeling. And so if the fish goes there when the cocaine and the morphine and whatnot are there, that's weighty evidence to suggest that the fish is being driven by feelings, dissociated in this case from the underlying survival functionality. So we haven't yet done this. We're trying to design a similar test for our artificial agent to see, can we dissociate? Can we show that feelings in and of themselves motivate the agent to act in the way that it does? We also haven't yet done, going to create artificial, virtual reality environments of the same environment as our artificial agent is navigating, using human subjects and seeing if they report the feelings that we expect the agent would feel in the situations that it finds itself in. Lastly, there must be some form of Turing test. In other words, some form of predetermined judgment criteria with a certain panel of people observing the behavior of the agent and not knowing whether this is a living organism or an artificial organism, and judging just by its behavior whether or not there is something it is like to be this agent, whether or not the choices, the voluntary behavior, the survival enhancing actions of this organism are driven by internal states or not. And that's all I have time. In fact, that's more than I had time to tell you. So I'll end there, and apologies again for going over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. This was fantastic. Let me fix the video here so we unpin you. So I wanted to actually say a few things before we kind of get started with the rest of the Q&A session. One is I realized there were a number of you who may struggle to have joined. There was an erroneous link sent at the beginning, which is one of the reasons why we took a while to get this started. So I apologize, but the good news is, because we're in an age of recording, this will be uploaded and we will have access to this. So, Mark, I'm going to be selfish here and ask you a question before I open it up to everyone else. I am so fascinated by this work, and I have I heard parts of this lecture the last couple of weeks when you and Carl Friston also spoke. My appetite is, I'm very hungry to know what is being done in your lab with these individuals. What can you possibly talk about concretely? I was also thinking about, how, scientists study viruses in these protected laboratories where, they're trying to figure out what makes the contagion more contagious. And they have to have all of these, double and triple firewalled safety protocols. And so I'm curious about that, how you set this work up in a scientific way. Is this protected from outside commercial interests who may be interested in knowing the details of your work? Is this something you can talk about? So,
thanks, Fred. Yes. Let's just, because I went 15 minutes over time, let's
yeah,
just first set the parameters in terms of our time frame. I'm
yeah,
happy to carry on until quarter after the hour. So
okay,
we have half an hour to go. Yes, anybody who knows the book that I wrote on this topic of consciousness, the title of which is The Hidden Spring, the final chapter of it is devoted to exactly the concerns that Fred has just raised. And I think we need to take them very seriously. If you start, as I have in my dotage, to my great surprise, if you start to think seriously it's possible to engineer an artificial consciousness, then you have to think about the ethical implications of that. They are twofold. The one aspect is what are the dangers to us? If you create an artificial agent whose sole motivating purpose is to continue to exist, then it might be that we are competitors with such an agent. It will do whatever is in its interests, not in our interests, which leads immediately to the second aspect of the ethics, which is, why should it do what's in our interests? If it did, it would be our slave. That's fine. All of our artificial intelligences are our slaves, but they don't feel like anything. If it actually has pleasurable and unpleasurable feelings, and it has a point of view and wishes and wants of its own, then if we reduce it to, or ensnare it in some kind of repetitive act, some kind of servience to us, servitude, then we have enslaved it. And it's not just that, it's also just the same rights as apply to any animal in animal research. If the thing can suffer, then it has rights, and you have to be protective of its perspective. So these things we take very seriously, and for that reason, we have not accepted commercial funding. We are wanting only to treat this as a scientific question. And unfortunately, when we first started about 5 years ago, it was a sort of almost pseudo-scientific question. It wasn't taken very seriously. It was quite hard to get funding for it. That has changed dramatically in the last few years. And now, happily, I can say our program is very well funded, ethically, securely, independent of any commercial interests. We're working very closely with the bioethics team of our Neuroscience Institute. Every step of the way, we are concerned about the ethics. Now you say, what have we achieved so far? What we've done, what we're just about to publish the first results, which are purely objective results, just showing that our agent outperforms any regular reinforcement learning type agent. So just showing, it's a kind of biological plausibility argument, that if using this mechanism that I've described to you enables the thing to survive in ways that all the existing machine learning functionality or architectures or formalisms do not, or better than them, way better than them, that says something. So that's all we've written that paper. We've just submitted it. That's all we've done so far. What we're doing now, I could spend a long time on this, so forgive me, I'll just be very brief. What we're doing now is trying to make the environment that our agent is living in, well, I say living, of course it's not alive, but surviving in, continuing to exist in, trying to maintain its own existence in. We're making the environment more challenging, and in particular, we're making the environment have tasks which enable our agent to display what kind of internal processes it's using, so we can measure those processes. Remember what I was saying about how do we test? We want to see, are the aspects of its internal activity generating the behaviors that we think are the causal mechanisms that we postulated actually driving the choice, actually driving the voluntary behavior, so that we can stimulate and attenuate those functions. So we're just wanting to make it more possible to visualize what's going on internally and measure what's going on externally, so that we can correlate the two with each other. There's a lot more I could say, like, for example, we've created in the environment opportunities for the agent to, rather than just meet a need, what's called exploit the environment. We've also created opportunities for it to explore the environment. In other words, all that it's doing is trying to understand better, what am I dealing with? Purely internal exploratory states, just to see, does it do that? So we created this hill where it can go up and get a sort of sense of where it is, rather than just looking for the resources. Where's the power supply? And things like that. These are the kinds of things that we're doing at this point. I hope I didn't lose track of my answer to your question, Fred, but there you have the answer. I hope it matches the question.
No, there's so much more I could ask you about this, but I don't want to hog up all the time here, and I do want others to speak. So Mark, as far as the time goes, you said how much longer would you be able to
I'm
answer
able
questions?
to carry on for a little more than 20 minutes. I can carry
20
on
minutes, okay.
quarter past. Sorry,
Okay.
Fred, one other thing I wanted to tell you is that
Yes.
we're setting up also a panel of experts who can verify, and by that I mean we want this panel to come up with prior requirements. In other words, if the agent meets these requirements, then we will say, okay, this is what we expect of a conscious agent. We don't want to do it ex post facto. We want to do it in the same way as one normally proceeds in science. As I said, we don't want to set a higher bar for consciousness than for anything else in biology, in terms of whether we do or do not understand what we're dealing with. Does our explanation lead to testable predictions which are not falsified? That's what we're trying to do. And so I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
So I am going to encourage everyone to raise their hands. I know there was chat comments as well, but if you raise your hand, I think that will be the best way for you guys to ask questions. So let me start with Bob here.
Mark, thank you for another amazing talk. You blow me away every time I hear you. I got the idea that you consider fish conscious and to be able to suffer, and therefore that they should have rights. Does that make it unethical for us to fish? Go fishing? Eat fish?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, I certainly do think that fish have feelings. And it's not just a hypothesis, it's a tested hypothesis. The evidence very strongly suggests fishes feel. Now, that leads to the second question, which has to do with the rights of fishes. And I know, when we use the word animal rights, it can sound kind of like woo-woo. So let's just be clear what I'm talking about, which is that if animals feel, then what we do to them has consequences for them, which have to be taken account of ethically. That said, let us not forget all kinds of creatures kill each other all the time. It is part of nature, that we are part of a food chain. And this sort of stuff happens. The difference with us humans is that we're aware, of what we're doing. And I think that therefore there's a special ethical obligation on us. It's not just what do we do to survive. It's also we should deliberate upon how we go about doing it and what the consequences are for the creatures to whom we are doing it. So I think on the basis of the evidence that I'm alluding to and have briefly described to you, I think that I would say it doesn't mean that we must never eat fishes, but it certainly must mean we must think carefully about in what way have these fishes landed on our plates. Has there been unnecessary suffering? Has there been industrial scale suffering? Has there been something equivalent to a genocide of these fish? Or is it part of the natural order of things where we have to accept, that some suffering is inevitable? There's some cost to another if I take account of the needs of myself. I like to use this kind of adage, which is that there is nothing wrong with self-interest as long as you recognize that others have self-interest too. So you mustn't think only about your own self-interest, but you can't negate your own self-interest. You need to balance your interest with those of others. And I think that just as that applies to other human beings, it should apply at least to a large extent to any other sentient creature. Thanks very much, Bob.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you. Utterly dazzling presentation, Mark. It just blew me away. A couple of things quickly I put in the chat, and one question I'd like to ask. Nietzsche anticipated some of this by saying in the 1880s, I think, that consciousness is man's most recent evolutionary acquisition and therefore the weakest. And our conscious mind has only the illusion of being in control. I'm sure that was one of the aphorisms that had an impact on Freud. Secondly, I wanted to mention blind sight as a wonderful example of much of what you were saying, people with cortical blindness that are able to make their way down a hallway with obstacles, and they have no idea how they did it. My question is it true, I heard this years ago, that the limbic system sends about 5 times as many neurons to the neocortex than the neocortex sends to the limbic system? Because I find that so fascinating.
Yes, so I'll start with your last question first. It varies from perceptual modality to perceptual modality, but in the case of vision, which is the model example that we're all using in cognitive neuroscience, the ratio is 10 to 1. Oh. So there are 10 outgoing axons predicting the visual signal for every one incoming axon that actually transmits what's transmitted is the error signal. In other words, only what was not expected is actually transmitted inwards, and the ratio is 10 to 1. So it's really quite extraordinary. And since we're talking psychoanalytical stuff here, let me remind you, Freud's view was that perception is first and foremost hallucinatory. And this is the view that we've come to in cognitive neuroscience, is that we call it controlled hallucination, that perception is an expectation which is then controlled by the signals which do not match that expectation. So sensation is just what is actually propagated inwards is only that which was not expected. And again, I say that's what Freud called reality testing. Oh gosh, you're going to have to read. What did you?
Blind sight was one.
Oh, your blind sight. Yeah. I think that is a very good point you make. What I said about these kids who have no cortex at all, they are just blind sight on steroids. The blind sight patients have no visual cortex. These kids have no cortex. So just as the blind sight patient navigates an environment by gut feel, and that's what they say. They say, I just guessed. I don't see anything. I just sort of intuit my way through it. That's what these kids do, not only in relation to the visual world, but to the world as a whole. They just respond intuitively with gut feeling, without any knowledge, without any images that they can experience. as guiding what they're doing. But there was another thing you said in
Oh,
between.
just that Nietzsche said that a consciousness.
Oh, yes, yeah. So about that, I want to say that, sorry, if you're wondering why I'm so distracted, I must just tell all of you, my stepdaughter is busy giving birth as we speak, and I'm getting messages on my phone about, what's going on. So I'm not dementing, I'm just distracted. So the way I look on this question of free will is I'd like to say two things about it. The one is that it's probabilistic. It's not just like we either have it or we don't have it. And I think that the probabilistic constraints are underwritten, you might not be surprised to hear, by feeling, in the sense that, let me illustrate it like this. It's true that Daniel entered the lion's den. This was a supreme act of free will, that despite the fact that normally one does not wish to be in a lion's den, Daniel entered it. And I think this illustrates the point. You can choose to do something. You can always choose to do anything. But the likelihood that you will do it is constrained by feeling. In other words, the reason that most of us are not Daniel and don't do what Daniel did is because we shit scared when we're in lions' dens. So we don't go there, but you can override that feeling, but the chances of you doing that are slim. So this is why I'm saying free will is probabilistic. It's constrained by feeling, which ultimately is given by natural selection in terms of, what is likely to be or not to be in your best interests, or at least in the interests of your species. But the other thing I want to say, when I read what's being written about free will at the moment, like, for example, Sapolsky's book, Determined, when you read this, the thing that strikes me is that they write as if feeling doesn't actually have any causal consequences. So they're saying, look, you can see the neurons are doing this and the neurons are doing that, and behind that is these hormonal mechanisms, and behind that is all of this evolutionary history, so everything is determined. And I'm saying, yeah, but you're forgetting that it feels like something to be in that state, and the feelings actually make a difference. It's really quite remarkable, and I would even go so far as to say demoralizing, that even now in the 21st century, neuroscientists speak as if the feelings don't actually do something. To me, this is absolutely crucial. The fact that the brain has a subjective aspect, in other words, that it has the functionality to actually know its own states, tethered as they are to the states of the organism as a whole, this surely evolved for a reason, and surely it makes a difference. I mean, look at our own lives. What you do is at least in part determined by how you feel. Does it make you feel better? Does it make you feel worse? This is kind of like obvious. So what I've been trying to do in my work in consciousness studies is to try to show how feelings are part and parcel of the whole natural causal matrix of things, and they actually have causal powers of their own. And so, in order to understand free will, in terms of what I said earlier about it being constrained by feeling, is to recognize the feeling actually is a thing. It actually does something. Thanks very much, Richard.
Thank you.
Debbie.
Thanks. Thank you for the talk, and congratulations too. William James insisted that many things can be felt that we don't usually think about that way. Like a baseball hits a window and the window shatters, he would say that we feel causation and there's no unconscious inference. And he said we feel many different kinds of relations. That's, do you see any implications of that in the kind of thinking you're doing, or does that, when you expand the idea of feeling that much from good and bad and so forth, does that sort of call for a different kind of thing?
Yes, I think that you're touching on many very complicated issues there. And so forgive me for not doing proper justice to the full depth of the issues that you're raising. I will just say that the inference of causality is an inference. And what James is referring to there is this very deep and vexed philosophical problem that, and it goes back in empirical philosophy long before James. The whole way of how do we understand, and not only in empirical philosophy, it goes back also to German idealism and so on. How are we to understand causality? And this is a matter of the inference of the relationship between the two events that is in fact a subjective inference. And this is what James is talking about. I think that the meaning of the word feeling there is slightly different, but in important ways not different to what I'm talking about. When I say that feeling has causal power, I'm saying that it's not just that the relationship between two events is something that we have to infer. And remember, when I speak about the verification of whether or not an artificial agent has feelings, I'm talking about exactly that problem. How do we go about inferring cause and effect when the effect is observable and the cause is something felt? And so this is the way in which the connection between what you're saying about James and what I'm talking about is crucial. It's talking about the feeling not being the feeling in the sense of an intuition and inference of a connection, but the feeling itself having causal consequences. This is something absolutely critical for the future of mental science, is that we have to allow ourselves, and I'm going to say this very carefully, we have to the external point of view upon the system.
Oh, Mark, you're breaking up.
To be the system. The only way you can do that is to allow yourself as a scientific strategy to allow yourself to say, well, what is this like from the point of view of the system? The whole of psychology, not only psychoanalysis, I would go so far as to say the very possibility of a science of the mind, a psychology, a science of the psyche. You have to allow yourself to make inferences about what this is like from the point of view of the system. To use a very common and garden word, you have to allow yourself to empathize with the system. And when I put it like that, you see what we're up against. Neuroscientists are very reluctant to start empathizing, but with machines. But that's what we do with each other all the time. The only reason that I know that you, Debbie, are conscious is not because I'm observing it. It's because I infer it. It's because I place myself in your shoes and I say, given everything that you're doing, if I were you, then it would feel like this. That's what we do all the time, not only in our clinical work to a very high degree of sophistication, but it's what we do even in a meeting like this. You can never observe another mind. You can only observe your own. And we have to get around that problem. We can't, I keep saying, set a higher bar for the science of consciousness than for anything else. We have to be able, I haven't seen the Big Bang, but I infer that it happened. And the same applies when I infer the causal consequences of a subjective state in you that I can't directly observe. I'm sorry, I'm rambling now, but that's my answer. Thank you, Debbie. Risa, please.
Mark, I just wanted to interrupt. Amy couldn't raise her hand, and so maybe after Risa.
Thank you, Mark. Would revising the pleasure principle to speak of an affective drive known through its derivatives of expressed feeling, emotion, be clinically useful? And what relevance would this have for AI vis-a-vis psychoanalytic education? Thank you.
Well, let me start with something more general than psychoanalytic implications, which is that it links with what I was saying to Debbie. The pleasure principle, as Freud called it, is no different from an observable, external, objective point of view than what the behaviorists call the law of effect. This is Thorndike's law. Thorndike's law basically says anything that is consistently rewarding will be repeated, and anything that's consistently punishing will be avoided. But the words rewards and punishments were meant to inhere in the actual stimuli. So, squirting a lemon in the horse's face, it's the punishing causal power is in the lemon, not in the feeling that the horse has when it gets lemon juice squirted in its face. So Freud's view was, no, it's the feeling in the horse. He called it the pleasure principle, not the law of effect. In other words, it's not to do with the externally observable stimuli and responses, the actual causal power. The explanatory force is the feeling within the horse. And let's forget about horses now and come back to us. The feelings, the pleasures and the unpleasures have causal consequences. So you're linking what I was saying to the pleasure principle is absolutely on the money. But remember, we're dealing with this problem in relation to verification of conscious states. What we're talking about in this meeting is to do with artificial consciousness. And so this is why I'm linking it to the behaviorist law of effect and the Freudian pleasure principle, and how do we navigate this slippery epistemological territory between the two. But now you link it to psychoanalysis proper and questions within our discipline. And I'll just remind you of something very basic, truly basic, and I'll leave it at that because I see there are other questions and we're running out of time. Freud's pleasure principle is, of course, constrained by the reality principle. And so when I was saying during my presentation that everything that our agent does it's tethered to, is this good or bad for it? So what it's doing is it's palpating its confidence in its policies in relation to the incoming error signals. And by the way, they always have to equal 1. In other words, as your confidence in your policy increases, so your confidence in the error signal decreases, and the opposite. As your confidence in an error signal increases, things are not turning out as expected, so your confidence in your policy decreases. That is the reality principle. That is the constraint on the pleasure principle. But ultimately, the whole thing is driven by, is this or is this not what I want? But you can't, to quote, who was it? Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want. But if you take some time, you might get what you need. And that's the distinction I was drawing between the demand for mental work, and the work so demanded, or the question and the attempt to answer the question. Thank you very much, Risa. This very much is what our clinical work is all about, and it's nice to be reminded of such deep and fundamental principles underpinning everything that we do, and everything that applies to our own beloved selves in the way we live our lives. Thank you. Helen.
Actually, Amy.
Yes, Amy, forgive me.
Yes,
sorry.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So just going back to this point about how choice is directed by feeling. Many people, yourself included, seem to feel a need to create artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence. And so I'm just wondering how you think about this as a neuropsychoanalyst, how you understand what seems to be a very human feeling, a human sort of emotional imperative to fabricate intelligent, conscious life.
So I have two motives. The one is actually a motive that's been with me as far back as I can remember having motives that I was conscious of, which is that I wanted to understand what being is. What do we mean by experience. I am my experience, and presumably that is what I'm going to lose, and I'm rather sad about that fact. When I cease to exist, I will cease to experience. If I were to go into a coma tomorrow and you were to keep my body alive, but I was not experiencing, there's nothing in it for me. So the study of what do we mean by experience, what is it actually, how does it work, what is it for, I think it's one of the most worthwhile things you can do with the brief biological period of experience that you have. I mean, what else is there to do with it other than to properly understand what it is and to appreciate it? So it's a purely scientific motive. I want to understand what experience is. It's why I became a psychoanalyst. After I became a neuroscientist, I thought, but there's no experience here, So that's why I decided to come at the problem from the other side too, and see where we could meet. So, but that's one aspect of the motivation. I want to do it because I'm a human being, as you say. It's a quintessentially human thing that we reflect upon our own being, our own existence. What is it all for? How does it work? And all of that. But there's another reason that I do it, which goes back to the question that Fred asked right at the outset. It is an ethical question. It is this, that if it can be done, it will be done. And the basic science that I have drawn upon, what people like Carl Friston have taught us about the fundamental causal mechanisms underpinning homeostasis, the fact that we recognize that homeostasis is an extended form of that. It's not, the cat is out of the bag. These things are common knowledge now. They're common intellectual property. So anybody who wants to apply the free energy principle, active inference, the basic understanding of self-organizing systems and whatnot, to the problem of consciousness in order to engineer an artificial consciousness, they can do it. I can't stop them. Nobody can stop them. I have, however, confidence in my own ethical compass more than I do of, let's not mention the companies that come to mind. So I want to have some opportunity to be able to control the agenda once we believe that our intuitions as to how feeling mechanistically arises, in other words, once we're confident that we actually can engineer this, then you have something that you can control. You actually have legal standing then in terms of how this can and cannot be used. And I don't want to be naive about the possibility that it will be abused. Remember what I said, if it can be done, it will be done. You can't prevent others from doing it, but you have greater chance to be able to have a say in the regulation of how these things are used. And that's the second reason why I'm doing it, is I feel that I want to be involved in the process, to have some standing in the process of being able to regulate how we deploy artificial consciousness.
It's very understandable. And just to be clear, my question was not so much about your personal motivation, but just as someone who is part of this enterprise, this very human enterprise, if you have some sense in sort of a self-reflective way about humanity, in terms of what seems to be motivating us to want to do this, that we feel compelled. So it was more from that perspective, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I suppose that, and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but I think that the first part of my answer addresses that. I think that's why we want to understand these things.
Know ourselves better.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Amy. Helen.
I know you're on a time limit, Mark. So
yes, I just, in fact, here's my phone. And so I told them they can call me after the 1:15. They haven't called me, so let's carry on. I mean, I'm getting messages like, she's having contractions but can't feel them. So that's the joys of epidurals.
Well, just
Please, Ellen.
very briefly, a brief comment. I studied medicine many, many, many years ago, and I became enraged when I was trying to learn the anatomy of the brain, that there was a certain part of the brain, and I think it more or less is the same thing as the limbic system that you've been talking about. And there were 8 different terms for the same section of the brain with no explanation about what the difference was in these terms, or what this part of the brain accomplished and so forth. That was why I became enraged. And I finally decided, well, if you don't understand what's going on, you at least give a name for it. And I'm very excited to finally, with your lecture today, to finally be able to put more understanding in that area of the brain that so confused me years ago. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ellen. The reasons why we have this multiplicity of terms in anatomy is partly because we named structures in one creature with one term, and then in another creature with another term, not realizing they're the same structure. So, for example, I spoke of the superior colliculi this evening. That's part of what in non-human vertebrates we speak of it as the tectum. We don't use the word tectum means roof. We don't use that term when it comes to the human tectum. But when we speak of the colliculi as a whole, the superior ones and the inferior ones, then we speak of the corpora quadrigemina. And they just didn't realize this is, I mean, they wouldn't have dared to suggest that that this is just a human equivalent of something you find in every vertebrate. So it's got to do with the history of the discipline, you know, the starting with ignorance and moving to less ignorance. But the other problem is that many of these structures are given names which refer not only to their structure but also to their function. And it's these limbic structures that you're talking about, perhaps an excellent example is what Jaak Panksepp calls the seeking system. Most of his colleagues would call the reward system. One of his colleagues calls it the wanting system. Anatomically, it's called the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system. And all of these words refer to the same thing. So, you know, it's because of different views about what this system actually is and what it actually does. And then let us not forget that in case we hold it against anatomists, that the same applies in psychoanalysis too, where we have a plethora of terms for similar things and overlapping things, there's different views as to whether that is a vice or a virtue. As you may or may not know, Helen, I've been involved in this issue in terms of how we should translate Freud and Freud's language. One view is, well, we should just have a potpourri of terms and everybody can use whatever English word they want for the thing that Freud invented a German word for. The other view is, no, we have to have a standard vocabulary so that we all know when we're talking about the same thing. And in our field, it's particularly problematical because in anatomy, at least, you can say that thing over there, I call them the superior colliculi, you call them the tectum. I think, you know, when it comes to something of the nature of what we study, the fundamental object of study of psychoanalysis is invisible. You can never point to the sorts of things we study, and so the words we use are even more weighty in their consequences.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And I know the problem. Jamie.
Thank you. That was once again extraordinary. I am persuaded that the Solms-Friston theory of consciousness, for lack of a more official phrase, which I've been unable to locate, is more persuasive, to me at any rate, than integrated information theory. Each of them seems to be an account of what the substrate, material substrate of consciousness would have to have and have to be in order for consciousness to arise. I am a dinosaur in that I am a Cartesian dualist, and the reason for that is I'm persuaded by this neglected body of information which was put together for a very long time by people like William James and his colleagues in the Society for Psychical Research, whose modern exemplars are at the University of Virginia, Bruce Grayson with his book After, and elsewhere, like the marvelous philosophical book by David Lund at Minnesota, Persons, Souls, and Death, a philosophical investigation of an afterlife. And it seems to me that this theory your own could be very much correct, either because it is sufficient as it is, or because it's an account not of how consciousness can be produced by a rigorously defined sort of system that meets these criteria, but how consciousness can be embodied and localized. That it is an immaterial substance, and that accounts for all these anomalies, which we are not supposed to talk about. But that what you've articulated, I think even better than ITT, is how a material substrate can become the venue, the instantiation, the embodiment and localization of mind. And I'm hoping that eventually there will emerge from you and your team an engagement with that perspective. I'm wondering if that might ever happen.
Thank you. First of all, you said the Solms-Friston theory, and you're not aware of another word for it. So I'll just tell you the word that we use for it, although it's you're not to be blamed for not knowing it because we don't sort of bandy it about it as a brand. But the word we use for it when we talk among ourselves is the felt uncertainty theory, felt uncertainty. And I, of course, am biased, and I agree with you that it is a superior theory compared to integrated information theory. And I'll tell you why, from my point of view. The main problem with integrated information theory is that reifies information. Information is not something that you can understand from a purely third-person point of view. Information, although it's a physical quantity, it is inherently subjective. An event carries different information for two different observers, depending on what questions they're asking, what their prior knowledge is, etc. So information, the very word only makes sense scientifically in the way that Shannon introduced the concept. His paper in the late 40s, the title says it all. It was a mathematical theory of communication. In other words, it has to do with a question asker that's looking for an answer. Information is the answer to the question. You need an active agent that's asking a question, and the very concept of information as introduced by Shannon only makes sense within that relational context. So when I look at IIT, I ask myself, but where is the subject of all of this information? You know, and what the superiority, again, remember I'm biased, but in my view, the superiority of mine and Carl Friston's theory is that its starting point is how does a subject arise, and how does a subject arise? Why does it have to ask questions of its environment? And that is, you know, where does question asking come from? Has to do with the functionality, the specific properties of an agent of the kind that can become conscious. Now you raise a much more vexed question, which is the metaphysical question of the relationship of mind to matter. And I will limit my answer because now we really are going horribly beyond the time that we expected, and I must return to my family. But I will limit myself to saying this, that I am a dual aspect monist, which means I am not a materialist, and that may please you. I'm not a materialist. I am a dual aspect monist, which means that I believe that the material perspective is just that. It's an observational perspective, as is the so-called mental or subjective perspective. That there is only one Mark Solms, in my view. There's the one that I see in the mirror, which is this body, this material thing. And there's this other one that I experience myself to be with my eyes closed when I wake up in the morning. I don't believe these are two different things, Jamie. I believe they're one and the same thing, but the material instantiation of me is no more real than the subjective instantiation of me. The underlying unifying, organizing, monistic substrate is not matter, but rather something in the nature of a functional organization that you infer from these two realizations, these two phenomenal properties. So I'm a dual aspect monist. Dual aspect monists are not materialists. They recognize that. So what you like to recognize in terms of that matter and mind are not the same thing. And that the fundamental substrate is not therefore material, but rather something which can only ever be inferred from our observations, something in the nature of an abstract organizing principle. I hope that you can see where that fits with your Weltanschauung in a way that makes me perhaps more sympathetic with your perspective than any materialist would be.
That's why I could bring the question to you, a dual aspect monist, about my dualism, rather than bringing it to an actual physicalist. Thank you.
Yes. When it comes to these questions, when I say we have to infer the underlying mechanism, the underlying functional organization, I think that this partly reminds us of the limits of science. You know, we never see that final sentence in Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time. He says, and then this is about the theory of everything. He says, and then we will see the face of God. And I think, oh, really? I doubt it. You know, I think that science never gets to see the face of God. Science gets to infer. In other words, comes up with its best guess as to what lies behind what we can experience. But there will always be something unknowable. And science needs a bit of humility in this respect. However, I also have to say, because I don't want to fudge such important things. However, my best guess as to what lies behind experience is something that I'm now testing. So, you know, that's what this whole chat we're having tonight or today is about. It's about, it's not just, science isn't just guessing. Science is then testing the predictions that flow from your guess in order to see whether your guess is viable or not. So my faith, and I use the word very advisedly, my faith is science, but I recognize that science is ultimately a form of faith with its own conventions. Thanks very much, Jamie. I'm going to, Ed, we're going to have to end with you. I'm so sorry, Maria and Mark and Harriet. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm right there with you with the PANCSEP basis, or this felt uncertainty. And so I'm also right there with you with the two principles of mental functioning, this Lust and Unlust principle as this basis. And then if we just take this very simple, brief aspect of what Freud's doing in that first two principles paper, and we start to use some of your language, which is what I want to hear from you. This developmental move towards the reality principle that he mentions in that paper, that comes out of this sort of surrender of the more omnipotent aspects of the early reactivity and hyper interested movement of the organism, that somehow this attention faculty, which seemed to be the weakest faculty, reveals itself to be this most precious faculty that allows for this reality principle to emerge. And clinically for us, we've all kind of realized, like, hey, like, I never quite got this reality principle myself, and here I am trying to help somebody else get to this place of no longer just being this hyper interested reactivity kind of creature. In using your language, and which I just adore, thank you so much for all this deep work that you've done, and your excitement is just contagious here, and your compassion too, your feeling for your brother, the stories, the kids that have no cortex or whatever, this deep empathic quality that you have. How do you begin to introduce this more abstract reality principle into these kind of conversations, and not just starting with the first principles that we're going to see with the AI, but us today with our supposed rational capacities? Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Look, I think that that paper, the formulations on the two principles of mental functioning, it's an indication. It's not the only one. I mean, if you go back to the project or you go forwards to Beyond the Pleasure Principle, you see the scale on which Freud is thinking. He's not thinking about, how does this patient's mind work? How are we to understand OCD or whatever the case may be? He's asking about what is a mind, in general, and he's thinking in evolutionary time and really extended evolutionary time. If you think of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and in the the project, he's really trying to grapple with, like, fundamentally, what is a mind, what does it do, and why did it emerge in nature, and how did it emerge from non-mental things that preceded it, and the two principles paper is in that tradition. It's a remarkable paper. The next thing I want to say is that that it's important for us in psychoanalysis to recognize that this places Freud in a certain tradition. These are timeless questions. Others before Freud have grappled with them, and others since Freud have grappled with them. So the kind of thing that drew me, for example, to Carl Friston is that he's grappling with the same questions. This is not something that is the private game reserve of psychoanalysis. It's if we're wanting to develop beyond what Freud taught us, and if we're wanting to contribute what Freud taught us to what others are thinking about on the same topic, then we need to be part of the game. We need to start finding common language where we can communicate with each other, rather than just stick within our own echo chamber. So that paper of Freud's, I think it's brilliant, and it contains many important insights. And the one that you're referring to, I'll come to in a minute. But the one of many things in that paper that has a particular importance to me is that there, for the first time, clearly Freud says that affect is the fundamental form of consciousness. That secondarily, with the development of the reality principle, which is your main point, it gets extended onto perception. In other words, I feel like this about that becomes relevant when reality is constraining how you feel and influencing how you feel. So that's one of the many important insights in that paper, which the one about prior to the reality principle, that consciousness exists prior to perceptual consciousness, and it's fundamentally affective, is what Freud says there. But the whole question of the development of the reality principle, I just touched in my oral presentation in our meeting today upon how we think of the constraints upon, we were speaking about 10 to 1 neurons in terms of the outgoing prediction and the incoming error signal. That incoming error signal is the vehicle of the reality principle. Error signals are, I've said it more than once in this meeting, the computational equivalent of reality testing. And so linking Freud's insights with the translating his terminology into the terminology of contemporary computational neuroscience is to be part and parcel of the conversation. Because I say again, Freud's perspective, as old as it may be, carries with it what can be gained from studying the mental instrument from the viewpoint of being one. Freud's great contribution was that he did not shy away from the brute fact that the mind is first and foremost something subjective, that part of nature is experiential, what he called psychical reality. And so even though it's more than 100 years on, in the case of the paper you're talking about, still Freud's inferences about the fundamental nature of the mental, how it evolved, what it's there for, etc., are infused with what we recognize about it when we address it from the perspective of subjectivity, of being the mind. I think that there are some things, the fact that subjectivity evolved is surely, as I said earlier, not an accident. It surely does something, and you will never understand how this part of nature works unless you take into account why and how it comes to feel like something. And so I think that there's an important contribution that psychoanalysis via Freud's fundamental insights has to make, even to contemporary debates on these topics. I'm terribly sorry. I really must go. Maria Rappaport, with a surname like yours, I'm so sorry that I'm not going to be able to talk to you, and Mark Mellinger and Harriet Kelly too, and especially you, Maria, because you waited so long. I'm really sorry, but I absolutely have. They're all waiting for me. They're wanting to have supper. My partner's with daughters giving birth and God knows what. I really have to go.
Generosity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thanks,
Mark.
Despite all my distractions, I have to say, of course, I enjoy this conversation very much, and especially talking about this topic with psychoanalysts is a treat for me. Thank you very much.